Picture this. You're stumbling through a dense primeval forest 40,000 years ago, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wild beasts, your bare feet sinking into the mud as twilight falls. Suddenly you hear rhythmic grunts echoing from a nearby cave, not the sounds of hunting or gathering, but something far more primal and disturbing. Shadows flicker against the rock walls from a flickering fire, and as you peer inside, you witness a scene that freezes your blood. A group of early humans engaged in acts so raw, so intertwined with violence and ritual, that they blur the line between survival, spirituality, and sheer horror. These aren't the romanticized tales of ancient love we see in movies. These are the most horrific sexual practices of prehistorical times, forgotten rituals that make modern atrocities pale in comparison. And what you're about to uncover isn't just dusty artifacts. It's a window into the darkest corners of human evolution, where sex wasn't about pleasure or partnership, but about power, dominance, and sometimes unimaginable cruelty. Before we dive deeper into these shadowy depths of our ancestors' world, if you thrive on unearthing the hidden horrors of history that textbooks dare not touch, hit that like button right now and subscribe for more bone-chilling revelations like this. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're tuning in from, whether it's a bustling city or a quiet corner of the globe. It's mind-blowing how we're all connected through these ancient echoes, piecing together the puzzle of humanity's twisted past from across the miles. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. So let's build this community of truth seekers together. What makes these prehistoric sexual practices so profoundly disturbing isn't just their explicit nature, but how they reveal the raw underbelly of human instinct before civilization imposed its fragile rules. We're talking about a time when Homo sapiens were still sharing the planet with Neanderthals, when survival meant constant battles against predators, famine, and the elements. Sex in this brutal arena wasn't a private affair. It was often public, ritualistic, and laced with elements that today we'd label as abuse, violation, or even taboo perversions. Ancient cave art from sites like Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain doesn't just show hunting scenes. Hidden among the bison and mammoths are subtle depictions of human figures in positions that suggest far more than innocent embraces. Scholars debate these images. Were they fertility rites or something darker? But one thing is clear. In the Paleolithic era, roughly 2.5 million to 10,000 years ago, sex was intertwined with supernatural beliefs, where acts of intimacy could invoke gods, ensure bountiful hunts, or even ward off death itself. Imagine the scene inside one of those caves. The air is heavy with smoke from a fire made of animal fat and bones, the walls alive with ochre paintings of swollen-bellied women and erect phalluses carved into stone. These aren't mere doodles. They're evidence of a worldview where sexual acts were performed as offerings to unseen forces. But here's where it gets horrific. Some researchers drawing from rock art in Europe and Africa suggest that bestiality or sexual relations with animals might have been part of these rituals. Think about it. In a world where humans saw themselves as part of the animal kingdom, not separate from it, blurring those boundaries could have been seen as a way to harness an animal's strength or fertility. Ancient myths like those later recorded in Greek lore about Leda and the swan hint at prehistoric origins, where such acts were not only practiced, but revered. Archaeological finds such as 30,000-year-old ivory carvings from Germany depicting human-animal hybrids in explicit poses support this. Was it consensual in their minds? Or was it a form of dominance, where capturing and violating an animal mirrored the conquest of nature itself? The horror lies in the psychological imprint. Early humans, driven by desperation, might have normalized what we now see as profound violation, passing these practices down through generations as sacred traditions. And it didn't stop at bestiality. Evidence from skeletal remains tells a grimmer tale. In sites like the 12,000-year-old Natufian culture in the Levant, archaeologists have unearthed bones showing signs of violent trauma around the pelvic areas, suggesting sexual violence was rampant during raids between tribes. Picture a nomadic group ambushing another at dawn, not just for food or territory, but to claim women, or even men, as spoils, subjecting them to forced acts that reinforced tribal hierarchies. This wasn't random. it was systematic, a way to break spirits and assert control in an era without laws or mercy. One particularly chilling discovery comes from a cave in Croatia, where 25,000-year-old human remains show deliberate fractures to the limbs and genitals, possibly from ritualistic mutilation tied to sexual rites. Were these victims sacrifices to fertility deities, their suffering believed to bring rain or abundant game? The patterns in the bones, repeated blunt force to sensitive areas, paint a picture of prolonged agony, where sex and pain were fused into a single, terrifying experience. As we venture further into the Neolithic period, around 10,000 to 4,000 years ago, when humans began settling into villages and domesticating animals, these practices evolved but grew no less horrific. Farming brought stability, but also inequality. Leaders emerged, and with them the power to enforce twisted customs. In places like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, wall paintings and figurines depict scenes of group sexual activities that border on orgiastic rituals, but with a dark twist. Some show figures bound or in positions of clear subjugation. Was this consensual, communal bonding, or enforced participation where refusal meant exile or death? The horror amplifies when we consider the role of children in these societies. Pederasty, or sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, has roots stretching back to prehistory, as evidenced by ancient art from Mesopotamia and early European sites. In a world where mentorship meant survival skills, these bonds could turn exploitative, with power imbalances leading to lifelong trauma. Imagine a young boy, barely past puberty, initiated into adulthood through acts framed as teaching, but laced with coercion, his innocence shattered in the name of tradition. But let's not gloss over the evidence of outright sadism. From the web of history, we know that in some prehistoric cultures, sexual acts were paired with violence to an extreme degree. Take the Moche civilization in Peru, thriving around 2,000 years ago, but with practices echoing earlier Andean traditions. Their ceramics depict explicit scenes of anal sex, often with elements of decapitation or bloodletting. These weren't just art. They were records of rituals where sex culminated in sacrifice. The victim's life force believed to fertilize the earth. One pot shows a woman penetrated while drinking from a jar, a straw in her mouth as if sustaining herself through the ordeal, while another depicts men in bestial embraces with mythical creatures, their faces contorted in ecstasy or agony. These artifacts, unearthed from desert tombs, reveal a society where horror and arousal were deliberately intertwined, perhaps to appease gods of chaos. Shifting to Europe, the Stone Age engravings from Majorca, dating back 5,000 years, show crude but unmistakable depictions of sexual acts scratched into cave walls, men and women in positions that suggest dominance, with tools or weapons nearby, hinting at coercion. And in Britain, 4,000-year-old bones from the Bronze Age reveal unprecedented violence. Tongues removed, limbs severed, even signs of cannibalism and evisceration, some tied to sexual contexts where victims were violated before or after death. A mass grave in France from 6,300 years ago uncovers warriors who tortured enemies, severing arms as trophies after what appears to be ritual rapes, their bodies displayed in pits as warnings. The psychological terror here is palpable. These weren't quick deaths, but drawn-out spectacles where sexual humiliation amplified the horror, breaking not just bodies, but entire communities. As humanity transitioned from hunter-gatherers to settlers, these practices didn't fade. They morphed into structured rituals that influenced later civilizations. In ancient Persia, methods like scaphism, trapping victims in logs, force-feeding them to attract insects, had sexual undertones, turning the body into a bug buffet of slow decay, sometimes preceded by violations. Even in the Americas, early human ancestors left clues in rock art of acts that defy comprehension, like the viral X post of a child's skull in Israel, suggesting interspecies mating with Neanderthals 100,000 years earlier than thought, rewriting our origins with tales of primal unions that may have been forced or ritualistic. The thread running through all this is power, sex as a weapon, a tool for control in a world without mercy. But why did our ancestors engage in such horrors? Evolutionary psychologists argue it stemmed from survival instincts, where dominance ensured genetic legacy, but at what cost? These acts left scars on the human psyche. echoes we still feel in modern taboos. As we peel back these layers, remember this is just the beginning of our journey into prehistory's abyss. The deeper we go, the more the shadows reveal about who we truly are. This era's horrors extended to the commodification of bodies, where captured enemies from rival groups were treated as sexual property. In the early farming settlements of Europe, like those along the Danube River, mass graves from 7,000 years ago contained jumbled bones of men, women, and children, many showing peri-mortem injuries to the groin and thighs, signs of mutilation during raids. These weren't mere battles, they were campaigns of terror, where victors would publicly violate captives before executing them, a practice that instilled fear and solidified alliances. One chilling find from a pit in Germany reveals a young woman's skeleton with her legs forcibly spread and pinned by stones, her pelvis shattered, suggesting a ritual gang rape followed by burial, alive. The psychological warfare here was ingenious in its cruelty. Survivors would carry the trauma back to their tribes, spreading tales that weakened morale and discouraged resistance. And it wasn't limited to women. Male captives faced emasculation, their genitals removed in ceremonies that symbolized the stripping of manhood, turning warriors into broken symbols of defeat. These acts, preserved in the soil for millennia, speak to a time when sex was weaponized to dismantle identities, much like how modern conflicts echo these ancient brutalities. Venturing into Asia, prehistoric sites in China and India yield even more disturbing evidence. In the 8,000-year-old Jiahu settlement in Henan province, flutes made from crane bones and turtle shells accompany burials where bodies are arranged in explicit poses, legs intertwined and hands placed on erogenous zones. But forensic analysis reveals darker truths. Some skeletons show ligature marks around the neck and wrists, hinting at asphyxiation during sexual acts, perhaps erotic games gone fatal, or deliberate killings framed as offerings to ancestors. Imagine a shaman leading a rite by the Yellow River, where participants are bound and stimulated to the point of death, their final breaths believed to carry prayers to the spirit world. This fusion of pleasure and peril wasn't accidental. It was a calculated horror, reinforcing the shaman's power by demonstrating control over life itself. Further south, in the Indus Valley precursors around 9,000 years ago, clay figurines depict goddesses with exaggerated sexual features, but excavations uncover underground chambers with chains and hooks, possibly used for restraining individuals during fertility festivals. These festivals, timed with monsoons, involved mass couplings, where social outcasts or slaves were sacrificed through prolonged sexual exhaustion, their bodies discarded in rivers as gifts to the gods. Across the oceans in the prehistoric Americas, the horrors took on a ritualistic fervour that rivaled any old world savagery. In Mesoamerica, sites like those of the Olmec civilization, dating back 3,000 years but rooted in earlier hunter-gatherer traditions, feature colossal stone heads and altars etched with scenes of copulation amid serpents and jaguars. But buried beneath these monuments are remains showing trepanation, holes drilled into skulls, combined with genital trauma, suggesting surgeries performed during sexual rites to release demons or enhance ecstasy. Picture a jungle clearing, torches flickering as a priest bores into a participant's head while others engage in acts around them, blood mixing with sweat in a frenzy believed to summon rain gods. Even more grotesque are the findings from Andean caves, where 5,000-year-old mummies bear tattoos of phallic symbols and scars from self-inflicted wounds during autoerotic rituals. These individuals, often young males, would mutilate themselves in isolation, using sharpened stones to heighten sensation, sometimes leading to fatal infections, a solitary horror where loneliness and desire twisted into self-destruction. In Australia, the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, passed down for 65,000 years, encode practices that outsiders might view as horrific. Rock art from Arnhem Land depicts increased ceremonies where sexual acts with multiple partners, including kin, were performed to multiply animal populations. But oral histories whisper of darker elements, initiations involving sub-incision, where the penis was split open with stone tools, not just for cultural marking, but as part of endurance tests laced with homoerotic elements. Young initiates, bleeding and in agony, were then subjected to further acts by elders, forging bonds through shared suffering. The pain was immense, often causing permanent damage, yet it was revered as a passage to manhood. This practice, echoed in some Pacific Island cultures, highlights how prehistoric societies normalized body modification as sexual rite, turning personal horror into communal strength. As we explore these global threads, a pattern emerges. Prehistoric sex was often a battleground for dominance, where the strong imposed their will on the weak, cloaking it in spiritual justification. In Africa, the cradle of humanity, 100,000-year-old ochre engravings from Blombos Cave show abstract symbols that anthropologists interpret as early erotica, but nearby fossils reveal interspecies violence, Homo sapiens potentially forcing unions with Homo erectus remnants, leading to hybrid offspring born of conflict rather than consent. The genetic legacy we carry today might stem from such primal horrors, a reminder that our DNA whispers tales of ancient violations. But perhaps the most skin-crawling aspect is how these practices involved the supernatural, with sex as a conduit to the dead. In Siberian sites from 20,000 years ago, shamans would engage in necrophilic acts with preserved corpses, believing it transferred life essence. Imagine a frozen tundra, a body exhumed from permafrost, warmed by fire, and used in a ritual to commune with ancestors, the ultimate taboo, blending grief with grotesque intimacy. These acts, evidenced by disturbed graves and tool marks on bones, show how far humans went to conquer death through desire. Evolutionary biology offers clues. In a world of high mortality, such extremes ensured genetic diversity, but at the expense of individual suffering. As societies grew, these horrors laid the groundwork for later empires' excesses, from Roman orgies to Aztec sacrifices. Yet understanding them humanizes our ancestors, not as monsters, but as survivors navigating a brutal world. The abyss stares back, revealing that the line between then and now is thinner than we think. Peering further into this thin veil between prehistoric savagery and our modern sensibilities, we must confront how these sexual horrors weren't isolated incidents, but woven into the very fabric of early human culture, shaping beliefs that persisted for millennia. As communities grew more complex, so did the rituals, transforming raw instincts into elaborate ceremonies that demanded ever greater sacrifices. In the heart of prehistoric Europe, during the Copper Age around 5,000 years ago, sites like Varna in Bulgaria reveal opulent graves filled with gold artifacts, alongside skeletons bearing ritual scars, incisions around the genitals, possibly from bloodletting during sexual trances. These weren't mere burials. They were testaments to a society where elites conducted marriage rites with the divine, involving hallucinogenic plants and forced couplings that blurred reality and nightmare. Imagine a chieftain, adorned in hammered gold, presiding over a pit where chosen participants ingested mushrooms, their visions guiding acts of group intimacy that escalated to violence. Archaeological evidence shows some victims with throats slit mid-act, their blood collected in vessels believed to anoint fields for prosperity. This fusion of sex, drugs, and death created a hallucinatory horror, where participants might not even distinguish consent from command. Their minds fractured by substances that amplified every sensation to agonizing heights. In the shadows of these ceremonies lurked even darker practices tied to fertility cults. Across the Mediterranean, in Malta's megalithic temples dating back 5,500 years, underground hypogeums echo with the ghosts of rituals where priestesses orchestrated orgies in pitch-black chambers. Carvings of spiral patterns, symbolizing rebirth, accompany bone fragments with tool marks suggesting genital modification. Women's labia pierced with bone needles, men's foreskins ritually excised in public displays. These acts, performed without anesthesia, were endurance tests with screams echoing through stone corridors as offerings to earth goddesses. The horror intensifies with discoveries of child skeletons in fetal positions nearby, hinting at initiations where prepubescent youths were exposed to these rites, their innocence corrupted to ensure the clan's continuity. One chamber in Hal Saflieni reveals walls smeared with red pigment mixed with human fat, possibly from rendered bodies used in lubricious rituals, a slippery, macabre aid to acts that bound the living to the dead. Participants, slick with this unholy mixture, would writhe in darkness, believing their union summoned ancestral spirits, but at the cost of psychological scars that echoed through generations. Turning to the ancient Near East, the horrors took on a mythological grandeur that influenced biblical tales. In Sumerian precursors around 6,000 years ago, clay tablets and seals depict Inanna, the goddess of love and war, demanding sexual tributes that involve bestial elements. Priests coupling with sacred animals, like goats or lions in temple precincts. These weren't symbolic. Zooarchaeological remains from Uruk show animal bones with unusual fractures, suggesting restraint during acts meant to embody divine possession. Imagine a ziggurat's inner sanctum, incense thick in the air, where a high priestess selects a bull for a ritual union, the act witnessed by chanting crowds as a plea for bountiful harvests. But failure, such as an animal's resistance, could lead to the participants' ritual flaying, their skin draped over altars as a warning. This practice echoed in later Egyptian rites where pharaohs symbolically mated with Nile crocodiles through proxies, blended reverence with repulsion, turning sex into a high-stakes gamble with mortality. Across the Pacific, in Polynesian prehistory, voyaging cultures carried horrors from island to island. Oral traditions from Hawaii and New Zealand speak of mana rituals, where sexual energy was harnessed through taboo acts like incestuous unions between siblings to concentrate power. Archaeological sites on Easter Island, with its monolithic moai, hide caves where petroglyphs show figures in contorted poses, limbs bound with vines, suggesting bondage as part of fertility dances. These dances, performed during volcanic eruptions, involved whipping and piercing to heighten arousal, blood flowing as libations to appease angry gods. The isolation of these islands amplified the terror. Escape was impossible, and dissenters faced exile to shark-infested waters after public humiliation. In Fiji, pre-colonial evidence from shell middens includes human teeth filed to points, used in sadistic foreplay, where partners bit and tore flesh. Believing the pain forged unbreakable bonds. This masochistic element, preserved in folklore, reveals how prehistoric islanders turned vulnerability into a perverse strength, their bodies marked forever by scars that told stories of endured agony. In the frozen north, Siberian and Arctic peoples practiced sexual horrors adapted to their harsh environments. Among the Chukchi, traditions dating back 4,000 years involved spirit spouses, shamans engaging in intercourse with effigies made from enemy bones, animated through trance states. But darker accounts from ethnographic records hint at live captives used instead, their bodies exposed to sub-zero temperatures during acts, freezing limbs as a form of slow torture. Imagine a yurt in blinding snow, a captive bound to a sled, violated while frostbite set in, the act believed to steal their warmth for the tribe's survival. This cryogenic cruelty extended to self-mutilation, where men would castrate themselves in rituals to become soft men, serving as communal partners in a society where gender roles bent to necessity. The pain of such transformations without tools beyond flint knives was excruciating, often leading to death from shock or infection. Yet survivors gained revered status, their suffering a bridge to the spirit world. As we trace these threads, the role of women in these horrors emerges as particularly poignant. In many prehistoric societies, females bore the brunt, their bodies sites of both veneration and violation. In Celtic precursors from 3,000 years ago, bog bodies like the Lindo Man show evidence of triple death, strangulation, drowning and blows, preceded by sexual acts, as pollen analysis reveals traces of ergot, a hallucinogen that induced erotic frenzies. These bog brides were likely chosen for their beauty, seduced or forced into unions before sacrifice, their preserved flesh whispering tales of betrayed trust. The psychological manipulation here was masterful. Victims often went willingly, indoctrinated to believe their suffering ensured communal prosperity. Evolutionary lenses reveal why such practices proliferated. In resource-scarce worlds, they reinforced group cohesion through shared taboos, weeding out the weak while rewarding the resilient. But the human cost was immense, seeding traumas that manifested in later mythologies. Think of Greek tales of gods raping mortals, echoes of prehistoric realities. As we delve deeper, these stories challenge our self-image, forcing us to question if civilization truly tamed the beast within or merely dressed it in finer clothes. The prehistoric abyss continues to unfold, each revelation a step closer to understanding our shadowed origins. As Homo erectus spread across the continent 1.5 million years ago, these rituals grew more communal and terrifying. In South Africa's border cave, 200,000-year-old remains show teeth filed to fangs and bones etched with phallic symbols, hinting at oral modifications for enhanced stimulation during group acts. Tribes would circle fires, chewing psychoactive roots to induce trances, then engage in frenzied couplings where biting and tearing flesh amplified ecstasy. Skeletal evidence reveals jaw fractures and missing teeth, suggesting these love bites often turned fatal, with infections spreading like wildfire in the humid climate. The horror lay in the social enforcement. Outcasts or rivals were forced into the centre, violated by the group as a rite of exclusion, their screams blending with rhythmic drums made from stretched human skin. This communal violation, preserved in the oral traditions of modern San peoples, served as a bonding mechanism, forging alliances through shared guilt and power, but leaving psychological wounds that echoed in nightmares of ancestral spirits demanding more blood. Venturing into the Congo Basin's dense forests, where prehistoric pygmy ancestors thrived 50,000 years ago, we find evidence of arboreal horrors. Vine-woven platforms high in the canopy hosted initiations where adolescents were suspended upside down, blood rushing to their heads as elders performed acts meant to awaken their fertility. Archaeological pollen samples from these sites indicate the use of hallucinogenic vines, turning these suspended unions into disorienting ordeals of vertigo and vulnerability. Imagine dangling precariously over a 100-foot drop, the forest floor a blur, while bound limbs prevent escape. The act a test of endurance believed to commune with tree spirits. Falls were common, with broken bones in fossils attesting to the risks. Yet survivors gained prestige, their scars badges of having conquered fear. This aerial sadism extended to captured enemies, hoisted and left exposed, violated as vultures circled, a slow death that combined sexual humiliation with natural predation. In East Africa's Rift Valley, 100,000-year-old ochre mines like those at Pinnacle Point reveal pigments used not just for art, but for body painting and sexual warfare. Warrior bands would raid neighbouring groups, smearing captives with red ochre mixed with semen, marking them as claimed, before forced integrations that blurred kinship lines. Genetic studies of modern populations show high inbreeding rates, tracing back to these eras, suggesting systematic rapes during migrations, where women were herded like cattle, their offspring strengthening the victor's gene pool. One mass grave from Kenya, dated to 10,000 years ago, contains female skeletons with bound ankles and pelvic trauma, implying prolonged captivity in breeding camps, horrific precursors to harems, where exhaustion and malnutrition led to high mortality. The psychological toll was devastating, with survivors passing down tales of ghost lovers, spirits of the violated haunting dreams, influencing taboos that persist in folklore today. Shifting to gender-specific terrors, prehistoric. Africa saw women subjected to clitoridectomies as far back as 6,000 years ago, evidenced by Egyptian pre-dynastic tools and Saharan rock art depicting the procedure. In nomadic Saharan cultures, young girls were held down on sun-heated rocks, sharpened stones excising flesh in rites to purify them for marriage, screams lost in the windswept dunes. This wasn't mere tradition, it was control, reducing pleasure to ensure fidelity, with infections claiming many lives. Men faced parallel horrors in sub-Saharan initiations, where circumcision involved not blades, but thorns or animal teeth. The wound packed with herbs that burned like fire, testing resilience amid homoerotic mentoring that often crossed into abuse. These rites, echoed in Bantu traditions, forged warriors through pain, but at the expense of sexual dysfunction and trauma, shaping societies where endurance equated to worth. As migrations carried these practices outward, they hybridized with local customs, creating new nightmares. In Madagascar's early settlements, 2,000 years ago, influenced by African and Asian voyagers, rituals involved spirit possession, where participants were induced into seizures through rhythmic drumming and herbal smokes, then paired in uncontrolled acts that mimicked demonic unions. Caves on the island hide bones with bite marks and fractures, suggesting possessions turned violent, with no boundaries between pleasure and assault. This ecstatic horror, blending sex with the supernatural, reinforced shamanic power as possessed individuals were seen as vessels for gods, their ordeals divinely ordained. Evolutionary anthropologists argue these African horrors stemmed from high-stakes environments where scarce resources demanded aggressive mating strategies, favouring those who dominated through force. Yet they also fostered resilience, with genetic markers for pain tolerance tracing back to these eras. As we connect these dots, the prehistoric map reveals a continent where sex was a battlefield, sculpting the human spirit through fire and blood. But this is merely a glimpse. The global tapestry of terror continues to unravel, drawing us toward the dawn of recorded history, where these shadows began to take written form. Crossing into the vast expanses of prehistoric Asia, where mountains and steppes cradled some of humanity's most enduring mysteries, we encounter sexual horrors that blended nomadic freedom with ironclad taboos, forging practices that scarred both body and soul. In the windswept plains of Mongolia, 40,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens left petroglyphs on rocky outcrops depicting horse-riding figures in acts of pursuit, not just hunting, but capturing humans from rival clans for breeding raids. These engravings, weathered by centuries, show bound captives dragged behind mounts, their bodies exposed to the elements as victors claim them in mobile orgies that traversed endless grasslands. Skeletal remains from burial mounds reveal rope burns on wrists and ankles, alongside pelvic fractures from repeated violations during these journeys, where exhaustion and exposure turned sex into a weapon of attrition. Imagine thundering hooves kicking up dust under a merciless sun, a captive lashed to a saddle, enduring acts while the horizon blurred into infinity. The ultimate isolation, where cries for help dissolved into the wind, reinforcing the raiders' dominance in a land where mobility meant power. This nomadic terror evolved into more structured horrors as settlements emerged along the Silk Road precursors. In the Tarim Basin of Xinjiang, 4,000-year-old mummies preserved in desert sands display tattoos of intertwined serpents around erogenous zones, symbols of shamanic rites where venomous snakes were incorporated into sexual acts. Participants, often young initiates, would allow controlled bites during couplings, the poison-inducing hallucinatory states that mimicked divine ecstasy, but frequently led to convulsions and death. The mummy's grimaces, frozen in time, speak of agony mistaken for enlightenment, with some bodies showing ante-mortem amputations of fingers or toes as offerings to heightened sensation. In these arid wastelands, shamans wielded serpents like living phalluses, coiling them around partners in rituals believed to transfer reptilian resilience. But the reality was a venomous nightmare, where survivors bore necrotic scars as badges of spiritual favour, their fertility forever altered by toxic after-effects. Further east in prehistoric Japan, during the Jomon period 14,000 years ago, clay figurines called dogu depict exaggerated sexual features, but excavations in shell mounds uncover darker truths, human bones interred with sharpened shells used for ritual piercing. These tools, honed to razor edges, were employed in puberty rites where adolescents had their genitals laced with cords threaded through fresh wounds, restricting blood flow to induce prolonged arousal as a test of willpower. Imagine a coastal village, waves crashing against cliffs, as a circle of elders chants while threading sinew through tender flesh. The initiate screams harmonizing with the sea, the pain a gateway to adulthood, but often resulting in gangrene or impotence, dooming them to social exile. This practice, echoed in Ainu folklore, extended to marital bonds, where couples underwent mutual piercings, their unions literally tied together in blood, fostering dependency through shared suffering. In the Himalayas' shadowed valleys, Tibetan prehistoric sites from 5,000 years ago reveal sky burial platforms adapted for sexual horrors. Before vultures claimed the dead, bodies were used in tantric-like rites where the living coupled atop corpses, believing it absorbed the deceased's essence. Rock carvings show figures in congress with skeletal forms, a necrophilic tradition that blurred life and death in high-altitude isolation. The thin air amplified disorientation, turning these acts into hypoxic hallucinations where participants gasped for breath amid decaying flesh, risking disease and madness. Survivors claimed visions of enlightenment, but the toll was evident in graves filled with contorted skeletons, their bones etched with bite marks from frenzied unions that devolved into cannibalistic urges. Southeast Asia's jungles hid even more insidious practices among Austronesian ancestors 6,000 years ago. In Borneo caves, wall paintings depict headhunting raids, culminating in sexual desecration of trophies, severed heads mounted on poles, their mouths used in ritual fellatio, believed to capture the enemy's spirit. Warriors, adorned with fresh tattoos, would perform these acts before crowds, the horror amplified by psychoactive betel nut that stained teeth red like blood. Skeletal evidence shows cranial trauma from post-mortem violations, with some heads boiled and reshaped for these purposes, turning conquest into a grotesque intimacy that bonded the tribe through revulsion. As these Asian horrors spread southward, they intersected with oceanic traditions. In prehistoric Papua New Guinea, 10,000-year-old sites feature penis sheaths carved from gourds, but deeper digs reveal gourds used as restraints in fertility combats. Men dueling with bound genitals, the loser subjected to public humiliation by the victor's kin. This gladiatorial sex, marked by bruises and tears, in preserved hides, Hidkum, ensured only the fittest reproduced, but left a legacy of trauma in highland clans where such fights persist in myth. Genetic traces link these practices to broader migrations, showing how sexual selection through violence shaped Asian populations, favouring aggressive traits that aided survival in diverse terrains. Yet the human spirit's resilience shines through in art that subtly critiques these horrors, like subtle distortions in figurines suggesting resistance. Drawing closer to recorded history, these prehistoric shadows influenced early empires. The Vedic hymns of India whisper of Asvamedha, horse sacrifices with sexual undertones, where queens symbolically mated with slain stallions, echoes of ancient bestiality. In China, oracle bones from the Shang dynasty, 3,500 years ago, record divinations about sexual omens, rooted in Neolithic orgies where slaves were sacrificed mid-act to predict harvests. As we approach the threshold of written records, it's clear these horrors didn't vanish. They transformed, seeping into the foundations of civilization. The prehistoric world's sexual abyss, with its rituals of pain and power, reminds us that our ancestors' desires were forged in fire, leaving embers that still smoulder in the human psyche. The final layers await, where synthesis reveals the enduring impact on our modern world. As the final layers of this prehistoric tapestry unravel, we turn our gaze to the Americas, where isolated continents birthed sexual horrors uniquely adapted to diverse landscapes, from icy tundras to steaming jungles, before weaving all these global threads into a synthesis that bridges ancient shadows to our present day. In the frozen reaches of North America's Clovis culture, 13,000 years ago, as the first peoples crossed the Bering Land Bridge, mammoth bone tools unearthed in kill sites bear residues not just of blood, but of human fluids, suggesting rituals where hunters celebrated successful pursuits with acts atop fresh carcasses. These blood unions, depicted in subtle carvings on ivory, involved coating participants in warm viscera, blending the thrill of the kill with sexual release, believed to transfer the beast's power. Imagine a glacial plain, steam rising from a felled giant, as a band of fur-clad figures writhes in the gore, their bodies slick and freezing. The act a desperate bid for survival in an Ice Age world where fertility meant defying extinction. Skeletal remains show frostbite scars on exposed areas, with some bones fractured from vigorous exertions in sub-zero cold, turning ecstasy into endurance tests where hypothermia claimed the weak, their frozen forms left as offerings to the spirits of the hunt. Deeper into the continent, in the Great Plains prehistoric nomadic societies, 10,000 years ago, petroglyphs at sites, like writing on stone in Canada, illustrate vision quests, amplified by sexual ordeals. Young warriors fasting for days were bound to sacred rocks and subjected to sensory overload. Hallucinogenic peyote, combined with ritual flagellation of the genitals using thorny branches, heightening visions through pain. The engravings show figures with erect forms lashed to boulders, elders circling with switches, the strikes drawing blood that mixed with earth to form symbolic mud, applied during subsequent couplings. This masochistic rite, evidenced by scarred femurs in burials, forged spiritual warriors but often led to permanent nerve damage, rendering participants impotent. A cruel irony in cultures where progeny equaled legacy. The psychological horror deepened in communal retellings, where failures were shamed publicly, their visions dismissed as false, isolating them in tribes that valued hallucinatory prowess above all. Venturing southward to Mesoamerica's formative periods, around 7,000 years ago in the Tehuacan Valley, cave art and seed caches reveal fertility cults centered on maize, but with a gruesome twist. Human sacrifices preceded by enforced sterility rites. Victims, often captives from valley skirmishes, had their reproductive organs cauterized with heated obsidian blades, the smoke inhaled by participants in orgiastic dances around sprouting fields. Imagine a terraced hillside at planting season, torches illuminating writhing bodies as a priest brands flesh, the sizzle and screams invoking rain gods, followed by couplings that symbolically seeded the earth with pain. Archaeological finds include charred pelvic bones and pollen from psychoactive flowers, indicating drugged states that blurred agony and arousal, with some victims surviving as eunuch attendants, their mutilated forms constant reminders of divine demands. This practice, precursor to later Aztec excesses, ensured agricultural bounty through human cost, embedding trauma in the cultural DNA of civilizations that rose from these valleys. In the Amazon basin's prehistoric heart, 5,000 years ago, among Proto-Arawak peoples, vine-entwined clearings hosted jaguar rites, where shamans donned pelts and enacted bestial pursuits. Participants, painted with black genipap juice to mimic spots, were chased through undergrowth, captured and mounted in mimicry of feline mating, complete with claw-like scratches from thorny gloves. Cave deposits reveal human claws embedded in skin fragments, suggesting these pursuits turned lethal, with prey eviscerated if they resisted, their entrails used in fertility brews. The jungle's humidity bred infections rapidly, turning scratches into festering wounds. Yet survivors gained jaguar spirit, their scarred bodies revered. This predatory horror extended to intertribal raids, where women were hunted like game, violated in the canopy's shadows, their cries echoing through vines, a primal echo of survival where sex mimicked the food chain's brutality. South America's Andean highlands, home to the earliest high-altitude societies 8,000 years ago, featured chulpaos, stone towers where mummies were interred, but not before eternal union rituals. Living kin would engage in acts with the desiccated dead, bundled in textiles, to preserve lineage. High-altitude sites show mummies with repositioned limbs for accessibility, and tool marks indicating orifices widened post-mortem. In the thin air, where hypoxia-induced euphoria, these necrophilic acts felt transcendent, but risked altitude sickness and contamination from preserved pathogens, leading to outbreaks that decimated villages. Imagine a windswept plateau, a family circle around a bundled ancestor, weaving new life threads through old death, the act a haunting blend of reverence and repulsion that bound generations in cycles of grief and desire. Synthesizing these global horrors, a chilling pattern emerges. Prehistoric sexual practices, from Africa's scarifications to Asia's serpent rites, Europe's bog sacrifices to the Americas' blood unions, were universal responses to existential threats: scarcity, mortality, the unknown. Evolutionary pressures favoured those who ritualized sex to build cohesion, ensure reproduction, and confront fears, but at immense human cost, embedding traumas in our collective psyche. Genetic studies reveal markers for resilience born of these eras, yet also vulnerabilities like inherited phobias or relational dysfunctions that surface in modern therapy sessions. Mythologies worldwide, Greek minotaurs, Norse frost giants, Aztec feathered serpents, echo these primal acts, sanitizing horrors into stories that warn and enthrall. What haunts most is the thin line to today: echoes in cult practices, war atrocities, or even consensual extremes that push boundaries, reminding us civilization is a fragile veneer over ancient instincts. By unearthing these tales, we honour the suffered, gaining compassion for our flawed humanity. These prehistoric abysses teach that power unchecked breeds cruelty, but resilience endures, a spark in the darkness. As we emerge from this journey, carry these shadows as lessons. Hit like if they stirred you, subscribe for more revelations, and comment your thoughts below. Together, across time, we illuminate the past to navigate the future.